Hi, I am Victoria. For most of my life, my family treated my achievements like minor inconveniences that distracted from my older sister. I spent years swallowing their dismissals, convinced my hard work would eventually buy their respect. But when my father crashed the biggest corporate gala of my career to publicly forgive me for walking away, I did not shrink. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a legal eviction notice for the estate he was currently living in. What happens when the daughter you erased turns out to be the landlord you cannot afford to anger? Before we get into it, let me know your age in the comments, and welcome to Amanda Told Stories. The sharp chime of silver striking crystal sliced through the low hum of the Maritime Trade Gala. Hundreds of conversations evaporated into the humid New Orleans air. At the center of the ballroom, Charles, my father, stood tall. He held a flute of champagne he had not paid for. His voice, coated in that thick Baton Rouge drawl, boomed over the quiet crowd. To family, he projected, raising the glass toward me. And to forgiveness. A father's heart is always open. Tonight, I am finally ready to welcome back my prodigal daughter. A ripple of uneasy silence swept the room. A few polite, confused smiles broke out among the city trade commissioners. I did not flinch. I stood by the velvet-draped cocktail table, my posture straight, letting the weight of his unearned magnanimity wash over me. Instead of reacting, I reached my hand into the silk lining of my evening clutch. My fingertips brushed against the cold, crisp edge of a folded document. It was a parish eviction notice, stamped with the official seal of the civil court. It had been 365 days since I last spoke to Charles or my mother Valerie. A full year had passed since my own graduation. My hard-won celebration for surviving a grueling maritime logistics degree was abruptly dismantled to coddle my 25-year-old sister Savannah through a mild, unremarkable breakup. Now they were here trespassing on the biggest night of my career. They reeked of an old, decaying entitlement. Charles wore a tuxedo that belonged to a wealthier decade. Valerie stood beside him, her signature pearls resting against her collarbone, a tight, artificial smile plastered on her face. Savannah lingered a step behind, her eyes scanning the room of wealthy shipping magnates, oblivious to the gravity of the space she had just invaded. They expected me to fold. They expected the public pressure of Southern propriety to force my head down and accept their toxic grace. Charles shifted his weight, and the ice in his glass clinked against the crystal rim. There was a time when that exact sound, the rattle of ice in his evening drink, served as a warning bell in our household. It used to make me cower, signaling his shifting moods and the inevitable demands that followed. Tonight the sound held no power, it just sounded weak. The frantic rattle of a man running out of time. Around me, the architects of the Gulf Coast economy waited. My mentor Antoine tensed his broad shoulders, his eyes darting between the venue security and my father. The ballroom held its breath, wondering why these strangers were hijacking the gala and what I was pulling from my purse. I did not signal for the guards. I let Charles enjoy his stolen champagne for a few seconds longer. To understand how a daughter finds herself standing in front of the city elite, preparing to legally evict her own parents, you have to rewind. You have to go back to the stifling heat of Baton Rouge, to the day the crawfish boiled over. 12 months earlier, the Louisiana heat was already pressing against the window panes by 8 in the morning. My graduation day was supposed to smell like cayenne pepper lemon wedges and sweet magnolias. The backyard of my grandfather's sprawling estate, the house my parents occupied, was primed for a victory I had spent 4 grueling years earning. Maritime logistics was not a major you coasted through. It required brutal hours analyzing supply chains, port tariffs, and civil maritime law. I had clawed my way to the top of my class while working night shifts at a French Quarter dispatch center. Today was the day the struggle was supposed to materialize into celebration. A crawfish boil for 50 people. A moment where my family would finally look at me and acknowledge the work. Instead, The morning shattered before the water even reached a rolling boil. It started with a sound that was all too familiar in the Jackson household. A sharp, breathless wail echoing down the mahogany staircase. Savannah was awake. My sister did not just cry. She performed. Every tear was a production demanding an audience. I stood in the kitchen wearing the crisp linen dress I had saved up for months to buy, listening to the frantic thud of my mother pacing down the hall to Savannah's bedroom. I kept my eyes on the kitchen clock, watching the second hand tick forward. I knew the routine. I had lived it for 22 years. Savannah was 25, but you would never guess it by the way my parents catered to her. She was their delicate flower, a girl who treated employment like a mere suggestion and relationships like dramatic television. This time it was a guy named Bryce. They had dated for exactly 21 days. He had sent her a text ending things at midnight, and now my graduation day was collateral damage. I walked toward the base of the stairs, holding the wooden spoon I had planned to stir the lemonade with. The heavy oak door to Savannah's room was thrown wide open. Valerie, my mother, was kneeling beside the bed, frantically icing my sister's swollen face with a bag of frozen peas. Savannah clutched a silk pillow, wailing about how she was unlovable, how her life was over, how she could not possibly face a yard full of happy people celebrating someone else when she was in such profound agony. Valerie stood up, smoothing her tailored morning robe. She walked out to the landing and looked down at me. Her expression held no apology. It only held an order. "We have to call off the caterer," she said, her voice tight with that practiced Southern sweetness that masked her constant demands. "Savannah is having a panic attack, Victoria. She cannot handle a crowd right now. It is just too much noise." I gripped the wooden spoon, the edges digging into my palm. "You are canceling my graduation party?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "The deposit is already paid. The guests are already driving in from Shreveport and Metairie." Valerie sighed a sharp exhale that signaled her dwindling patience. "Do not be selfish, Victoria. Look at your sister. She is fragile right now. You are stronger. You do not need a party to know your father and I are proud of you. You are stronger." That phrase was the velvet rope my parents used to bind me. In their eyes, my resilience was not a virtue, it was a convenience. It meant they never had to worry about me. It meant they could pour all their emotional and financial resources into the daughter who constantly demanded fixing. Savannah was the project. I was the utility. I watched Valerie pull her cell phone from her pocket and dial the catering company. Without a hint of hesitation, she instructed them to turn the delivery trucks around. She cited a sudden family emergency. A mild breakup was an emergency. A college degree was a footnote. I did not scream. I did not throw the wooden spoon against the antique wallpaper. I just turned my back and walked into the kitchen. The silence that settled over me was not defeat. It was a chilling clarity. For years, I had believed that if I just worked harder, if I just achieved something undeniable, they would finally carve out a space for me. Standing on the imported tile floor, I realized my milestones would always be sacrificed on the altar of Savannah's manufactured crises. The kitchen counter was a battlefield of Savannah's entitlement. Empty boxes from expensive boutiques overflowed from the recycling bin. Discarded packaging from luxury skincare brands she bought to soothe her anxiety cluttered the marble island. As I moved to gather the trash, a stack of mail caught my eye. It was pushed haphazardly beneath a pile of torn tissue paper. The top envelope bore a red stamp. Final notice, parish property tax. I slid the envelope out. Beneath it were 3 more just like it. My brow furrowed. My grandfather had left this waterfront estate to the family, but the upkeep and taxes were Charles and Valerie's responsibility. My parents portrayed themselves as Baton Rouge aristocracy, attending country club luncheons and financing Savannah's endless stream of luxury whims. Yet here, on the kitchen counter, hidden beneath a $200 face cream receipt, was the raw truth. They were drowning. My parents were so consumed with managing Savannah's emotional tempests that they were entirely neglecting their reality. The financial rot was spreading beneath their pristine southern facade. They were financing a lifestyle they could no longer afford to keep their golden child comfortable. I traced the red ink of the final notice with my index finger. A normal daughter might have rushed upstairs to confront them, to ask if we were losing the house. But I was no longer a normal daughter. I was a tenant in a home that did not want me. I slipped the envelopes back under the tissue paper exactly where I found them. If they wanted to build a house of cards, I was not going to be the one to point out the wind. I walked over to the pantry and opened the door. Tucked on the bottom shelf, next to the spare table linens, was a cardboard box. Inside was a large vinyl banner I had quietly ordered for myself weeks ago. It read, "Congratulations, Victoria," in bold blue lettering. I had hidden it, hoping Valerie might stumble upon it and realize she had forgotten to order decorations. She never did. I pulled the banner from the box. The vinyl was heavy and smelled faintly of fresh ink. I did not unfold it to look at my name. I simply laid it flat on the counter and began to fold it, edge to edge, corner to corner. I pressed my hands along the creases, flattening the material until it was nothing more than a compact, silent square. Valerie's voice drifted down from the second floor, cooing softly to Savannah, promising her a shopping trip to the Gulf Coast to help her heal. I slid the folded banner into the trash bin, letting it fall beneath the empty boxes of Savannah's discarded purchases. I did not shed a tear. Crying required hope that someone might comfort you, and I had just run out of hope. My mind shifted to the only beacon of light I had left, the promise my father had made me. 4 years ago, Charles had sworn that upon my graduation, the restored vintage truck sitting in the carriage house would be mine. It was my ticket to independence, my daily commute to the New Orleans ports where my new job waited. They could take the party, I told myself, but they could not take my freedom. I washed my hands in the sink, drying them methodically on a linen towel. I prepared myself for the next morning, ready to claim the keys that would start my actual life. Little did I know, Charles had already decided exactly who needed a set of wheels for a healing trip. The Baton Rouge air hung thick with damp heat the next morning. I woke up before the sun pierced the Spanish moss outside my window. The sheets stuck to my skin, a physical reminder of the oppressive climate both inside and outside the house. There was no lingering disappointment from the canceled boil. I had boxed those feelings up and shoved them into a dark corner of my mind. Today was about the truck. My grandfather spent 3 years restoring that vintage navy blue pickup. He replaced the carburetor, polished the chrome bumpers, and reupholstered the bench seat with thick tan leather. When I started my degree, Charles stood in the carriage house, patted the cold metal hood, and made a rare, binding promise. The scent of motor oil and old leather surrounded us as he spoke. "Top of your class, Victoria, and the keys are yours." It was the only reason I tolerated the grueling night shifts at the dispatch center and the endless disrespect at the dinner table. That vehicle was my literal ticket out of their grip. I walked down the sweeping front steps, a travel mug of black coffee in my hand, ready to ask for the title transfer. The carriage house doors were wide open. The truck was parked on the crushed gravel driveway gleaming under the morning light, but the driver's side door was flung wide open, and Savannah was leaning against the tailgate. She wore an oversized linen shirt and dark sunglasses, sipping a green smoothie from a plastic cup. Beside her, 3 enormous designer duffel bags sat on the pristine truck bed. The heavy canvas and metal zippers were scraping against the restored wood paneling. Every scratch felt like a personal insult to the hours my grandfather spent sanding that wood. Charles walked out of the house jingling a set of silver keys. "Morning, Victoria," he said, not meeting my eyes. He tossed the keys through the humid air. Savannah caught them with a clatter. "Drive safe, sweetheart. Call your mother when you reach the coast." I stepped off the porch, the gravel crunching beneath my boots. "Dad, what is happening?" Charles adjusted his golf shirt, feigning casual indifference. "Your sister is taking a few weeks to clear her head. The Gulf breeze will do her good. She needs a change of scenery." In my truck, I asked, keeping my tone steady, refusing to let him hear my pulse racing. My fingers gripped the handle of my travel mug so hard, my knuckles turned white. "You promised me that vehicle today. I start at the port of New Orleans on Monday. I need it for the commute." Charles let out a short, dismissive scoff. It was a sound designed to make the listener feel small, unreasonable, and foolish. He waved his hand, swatting away my concerns like a bothersome gnat. "Do not be dramatic, Victoria. It is a temporary loan. Savannah needs a reliable vehicle for her healing trip. You can take the bus for a few weeks, or catch a ride with a friend. Be a sister for once." The theft was not hidden. It was paraded right in front of my face, in broad daylight. My 4 years of relentless academic dedication meant less than Savannah's 3-week failed romance. I was a utility. My rewards were merely inventory they could reassign whenever the golden child required pacifying. The stark unfairness coated my throat like ash. As Savannah climbed into the cab and cranked the engine, a memory washed over me, vivid and sharp. I was 10 years old, sitting on the wooden planks of the New Orleans docks. The air smelled of diesel fuel, muddy river water, and raw sugar pouring from the cargo ships. The sun beat down on our shoulders. My grandfather sat beside me, his hands calloused and stained with grease from working on the very truck Savannah was now hijacking. He was a man who understood the weight of legacy, building his fortune from the swamp up. He pointed toward an ancient oak tree growing near the levee. "Look at that tree, little bird." He had said, his voice a low rumble over the crashing waves of a passing freighter. "People fight over who gets to sit in the shade. They argue over who owns the fallen leaves. They spend their whole lives managing the surface. But in Louisiana, the law knows the truth. The leaves belong to whoever lives there, but the roots belong to the one holding the deed. Never confuse the two, Victoria. The surface can be borrowed, but the foundation is owned." I watched the navy blue truck roll down the driveway, the tires kicking up a cloud of white dust. Charles walked back inside the house, already forgetting I existed. My grandfather's words echoed in my ears. Charles and Valerie thought they owned the shade. They believed they could dictate who sat in it and who was cast out into the blistering sun. They operated under the delusion that their temporary authority was permanent. But I knew a secret they had long ignored. Relying on them for transportation, for approval, for anything at all, meant remaining in a perpetual state of debt. They would always hold the strings. Every gift was a loan with an astronomical emotional interest rate. I turned around and walked back up the porch steps. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind me, sealing out the stifling heat. I went straight to my bedroom. It was a stark, unadorned space, stripped of the extravagant decor that cluttered the rest of the house. I sat at my small wooden desk and flipped open my laptop. The screen illuminated my face in the dim room. I did not search for bus routes. I did not text a friend for a ride. I opened a real estate portal and typed New Orleans into the search bar. The port was calling my name, and I was going to answer it on my own terms. I filtered the listings, ignoring the luxury high-rises, and focusing on modest, sturdy apartments in historic neighborhoods, places with thick walls and heavy locks. I needed a sanctuary, a place where my achievements would not be repurposed to bandage someone else's fragile ego. I found a small unit in the lower garden district. It featured exposed brick large windows and a landlord who required an immediate deposit. I pulled out my debit card. The raised numbers on the plastic represented thousands of hours pouring coffee, organizing freight logs, and sacrificing sleep. Every dollar was a brick in the wall I was building between myself and this house. It was my money, untouched by Charles's conditional generosity. I typed the digits into the payment gateway and hit confirm. A confirmation email pinged in my inbox. Address. The physical escape was set in motion. But as I pulled my own duffel bags from the closet in the quiet shadows of my childhood bedroom, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a notification from a social media app. Savannah had reached the coast, and she had found a new way to weaponize her vacation. My physical escape was secured, but the digital war was just beginning. The screen of my phone illuminated the dark corners of my bedroom, casting a pale blue glow across the blank walls. A single notification sat on the lock screen. Savannah had tagged me in a post. I swiped upward, allowing the digital venom to load. There were 2 photos in the carousel. The first was a flawless, bright image of Savannah, posing on a pristine white balcony overlooking the Gulf Coast. She wore a wide-brimmed straw hat and a tragic, brave smile, holding a sparkling beverage. The second photo, however, was a masterpiece of calculated sabotage. It was a candid shot of me from graduation morning. I was standing in the kitchen, wearing my academic gown. My shoulders slumped, dark circles bruising the skin under my eyes. I looked exhausted, annoyed, and entirely drained. It was the exact moment Valerie had ordered me to cancel the caterer. Savannah had weaponized my exhaustion. Her caption sat below the image, in crisp black text. So hard dealing with a sister jealous of my struggles. Trying to heal by the ocean today. But the toxic energy back home is heavy. Empathy is free, y'all. Wish my family supported my mental health instead of competing with it. I stared at the glowing words. The sheer audacity of the narrative was breathtaking. She had stolen my celebration, hijacked my promised vehicle, and was now broadcasting herself as the victim of my imagined jealousy. The comment section was already a localized wildfire. In our insular Louisiana social circle, appearances dictated reality. Extended family members and country club acquaintances flooded the post with heart emojis and syrupy condolences. Aunt Patty wrote a lengthy paragraph about extending grace and praying for my bitter heart. Cousins I had not seen in a decade chimed in, advising me to do better and support my fragile sibling. They were writing a script for my life, assigning me the role of the resentful villain. The natural instinct, the response they were baiting me to deliver, was to type a furious defense. They wanted a public argument. They wanted me to sound unhinged so they could point and say they were right all along. I did not touch the keyboard. I did not draft a single word of rebuttal. Engaging in their theater meant stepping onto a stage they owned. Instead, I pressed a single button on my screen and deleted the application entirely. The colorful icon vanished, leaving an empty space on my digital dashboard. The silence in my bedroom deepened. The digital smear campaign was the final severed thread. It solidified a truth I had been circling for years. I could never earn their respect because they had already invested all their emotional capital in my failure. I did not wait for the morning. I did not wait for Monday. The exit strategy I had drafted in the back of my mind accelerated into immediate action. I moved through my bedroom with the clinical precision of a surgeon operating on a deadline. I pulled 2 canvas duffel bags from the back of my closet and unzipped them. I established a singular strict rule for this midnight exodus. If Charles or Valerie purchased it, it stayed behind. I opened my dresser drawers and began the purge. I bypassed the imported silk blouses and cashmere sweaters Valerie had bought to make me look presentable for her society luncheons. I left the expensive perfume sitting untouched on the vanity. I opened my jewelry box and lifted the string of pearls they had given me for my 18th birthday, setting it carefully on the nightstand. I wanted zero leverage held against me. I refused to let them claim I owed them for the fabric on my back. Instead, I packed the plain cotton shirts I bought from thrift stores on Magazine Street. I packed the sturdy denim jeans and the steel-toed work boots required for the shipping docks. I gathered my maritime law textbooks, my laptop, and the tarnished silver watch I had purchased with my first paycheck from the dispatch center. Within 40 minutes, my entire existence was reduced to 2 canvas bags. The bedroom I left behind looked like a staged model home, sterile, hollow, and entirely devoid of my essence. It was exactly the version of me they preferred. I checked the time. It was well past 2 in the morning. The house was submerged in the heavy quiet of deep sleep. Only the faint hum of the central air conditioning broke the stillness. I slung the heavy bags over my shoulders and stepped into the hallway. The floorboards creaked under my boots, but I did not slow my pace. Earlier that evening, before the digital ambush, I had quietly secured a rental sedan through a local app, coordinating a contactless pickup down the street. It was a nondescript gray vehicle, a ghost car, perfect for slipping unnoticed through the dark parish roads. I descended the mahogany staircase for the final time. The air on the ground floor smelled of Valerie's expensive floral potpourri and the stale scotch Charles left lingering in his crystal decanters. I walked past the formal dining room and stepped into the sprawling kitchen. Moonlight filtered through the large bay windows, illuminating the pristine marble island. I set my bags by the back door and walked over to the marble counter. I reached into the front pocket of my denim jacket and pulled out my key ring. The metal jingled softly in my palm. I sifted through the standard house keys and the small lockbox keys until my fingers traced the cold, rigid edges of a singular, distinct object. It was an ornate, heavy brass key. It looked antiquated, out of place among the modern aluminum keys. It did not unlock the front door of this Baton Rouge house. It was the original master key to my grandfather's waterfront estate. I unthreaded the brass key from the metal ring. The weight of it felt significant against my skin. Leaving it behind was not an act of surrender, it was a calculated message. Charles believed he held all the power because he occupied the property. He thought holding the vintage truck keys made him the gatekeeper of my freedom. I needed to leave a physical reminder that I was relinquishing my presence in their daily lives, but I was not relinquishing my foundation. I placed the heavy brass key in the exact center of the marble island. The metal clinked against the polished stone, ringing out like a judge dropping a gavel in an empty courtroom. I did not grab a pen. I did not write a letter explaining my departure. Notes are meant for people who care to read the truth, and my family had proven they preferred their own fictions. The isolated key sitting under the moonlight was the only statement required. It was the deed, silent guardian, resting in enemy territory. I turned my back on the kitchen, grabbed my duffel bags, and pushed through the heavy back door. The Louisiana night air hit my face instantly, blanketing me in a thick, humid warmth. The cicadas buzzed in a relentless rhythmic chorus, drowning out the sound of my footsteps on the pavement. The gray rental sedan was parked 2 blocks away, tucked under the shadow of a sprawling oak tree. I unlocked it remotely, the amber hazard lights flashing once in the dark. I opened the trunk and tossed my bags inside, shutting the lid with a soft, muffled thud. I slid into the driver's seat and pushed the ignition button. The engine purred to life, the dashboard illuminating my face in a soft orange glow. I shifted the car into drive and steered away from the neighborhood, taking a circuitous route to avoid passing the house again. The headlights pierced the dark asphalt, guiding me toward Interstate 10. As I merged onto the highway, the speed limit increased, and the dense Baton Rouge suburbs gave way to the sprawling, open swamps. The murky waters of the bayou reflected the moonlight rushing past my windows in a blur of silver and black. I rolled the window down an inch, letting the hot, rushing wind fill the cabin. The silence of the car wrapped around me like armor. For the first time in 22 years, the atmospheric pressure of Savannah's demands and my parents' conditional approval vanished. My lungs expanded, taking in air that finally felt entirely my own. I was heading toward New Orleans, toward the shipping ports, and a life built on my own merit. The physical severing was complete. The emotional tether had been cut with a single tap on a screen. But as the highway markers ticked by, marking the distance toward the parish line, my dashboard clock shifted to 4 in the morning. I was free of their roof, but the umbilical cord of their financial expectations was still technically attached. Charles and Valerie operated on a strict ledger of debts and favors. They had not yet realized their primary safety net had just driven off the edge of the map. And desperate people always notice when the safety net is gone. The dark stretch of highway ahead felt peaceful, but the illusion of a clean break was about to be shattered by a ringing phone. The tires hummed a relentless baritone melody against the elevated concrete of Interstate 10. Dawn was just beginning to fracture the ink-black sky, bleeding shades of bruised violet and burnt orange across the vast Louisiana horizon. The Atchafalaya Basin stretched out endlessly on either side of the highway, presenting a sprawling expanse of ancient cypress trees heavily draped in gray Spanish moss. Thick morning mist clung to the murky swamp water below the bridge, effectively hiding the predators that lurked beneath the calm surface. I gripped the faux leather steering wheel of the rental sedan, feeling the steady mechanical vibration of the engine traveling up my arms and into my chest. For the past 2 hours, I had driven in absolute unbroken silence. I turned off the radio. I ignored my downloaded playlists. I simply listened to the rhythmic thud of the tires, conquering the expansion joints of the bridge, carrying me further away from the suffocating grip of my childhood zip code. I was just crossing the parish line, effectively leaving their geographical jurisdiction, when my fragile tranquility shattered. The digital display on the dashboard suddenly illuminated, filling the dark cabin with a harsh, artificial blue light. An incoming call banner flashed aggressively across the touchscreen. The name displayed in stark white letters was Valerie. My mother was an early riser, but she never dialed my number at this hour, unless she required a specific task completed. I let the system ring 3 times, listening to the synthetic chime bounce off the glass windows of the car. A part of me, the deeply conditioned, dutiful daughter, felt a familiar spike of cortisol flood my veins. It was the biological response of a lifetime spent managing their crises. But the new version of myself, the woman who had deliberately left a brass key resting on a cold marble island, did not succumb to the panic. I simply reached out with one finger and tapped the green accept icon. I did not say hello. I did not offer a polite morning greeting. I kept my eyes fixed on the winding road ahead and just listened. "Victoria, you need to log into the banking portal immediately," Valerie commanded. Her voice lacked any trace of maternal warmth or basic curiosity about my whereabouts. It was clipped, urgent, and entirely transactional. The joint automotive insurance premium drafted at midnight, and Savannah managed to overdraw her checking account again. The transaction bounced. "You need to wire your portion plus her deficit before the bank opens at 8. If the policy lapses, your father will be furious." Savannah overdrawing her account was a sacred monthly tradition in our family. My older sister viewed budgets as offensive suggestions, treating her debit card like an infinite fountain of wealth. Valerie managed the household ledger with a twisted enabling strategy. She covered Savannah's exorbitant retail therapy by quietly extracting funds from my earnings. For years, I had subsidized my sister's luxury lifestyle under the guise of contributing to the family overhead. I paid for the groceries while Savannah bought imported silk. I covered the utility bills while Savannah booked weekend spa retreats. I was the silent, unappreciated investor in a failing enterprise. Valerie did not ask why I was not upstairs sleeping in my bed. She did not notice my car was missing from the driveway. She did not perceive my absence because she only ever perceived my utility. To my mother, I was not a daughter driving through the dangerous swamp at dawn. I was an automated teller machine possessing a pulse. The realization crystallized in my mind, feeling heavy and immovable. I stared at the yellow dividing lines whipping past my headlights, registering the profound tragedy of my family dynamic. "Mother," I replied, my tone completely devoid of emotion. "I will not be logging into any portal." A sharp intake of breath echoed through the vehicle audio speakers. "Excuse me?" Valerie snapped, her polished Southern Belle facade slipping instantly into something sharp and ugly. "You will do exactly as you are told. We are not having this policy canceled because you want to be stubborn and hold a grudge over a stupid party." "I am not being stubborn," I stated smoothly, navigating a slight curve in the highway. "I am no longer on that policy. I secured my own independent coverage yesterday afternoon. Furthermore, I will not be funding Savannah's deficit today, tomorrow, or any day moving forward." I moved out. The silence that followed was profound. It lasted for exactly 4 agonizing seconds before the chaotic shuffling of a phone changing hands transmitted through the speakers. Valerie had passed the device to the enforcer. "Victoria," a booming voice detonated inside the sedan. Charles had taken the receiver. His tone was saturated with patriarchal authority, radiating the kind of heavy-handed intimidation he used to bully local contractors and silence country club waiters. "What exactly is this nonsense your mother is babbling about? You are going to transfer those funds right this second, or there will be severe consequences." My father operated under the distinct delusion that his influence was absolute. He treated the entire state of Louisiana as his personal kingdom, genuinely believing his last name granted him the power to command the tides of the Gulf. He had spent my entire life dictating my parameters, ensuring I remained small, manageable, and financially tethered to his wallet. "I am driving to New Orleans, Dad," I answered, keeping my voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline surging through my system. "I packed my belongings. I left the estate. You and Valerie are solely responsible for Savannah's financial mismanagement now." "You listen to me, you ungrateful child!" Charles roared his anger, escalating into a frantic, breathless panic. "You do not just walk away from this family. You think you can survive out there in the city without my backing? You start that new job at the Port Authority on Monday, correct? I know the maritime commissioners. I play golf with the regional director. If you do not wire that money right now, I will personally call your new bosses and report your insubordination. I will tell them you are a massive liability. I will have your career suffocated before you even step foot on those docks." He was threatening my livelihood. He was genuinely willing to burn my hard-earned career to the ground, sabotaging my degree and my future, simply because I refused to pay my sister's careless bills. As his tirade continued, promising professional ruin and social exile, a massive 18-wheeler semi-truck merged into the lane directly beside me. The steel behemoth roared past my rental sedan. The sheer displacement of air shook my small car, rattling the glass windows and vibrating the steering column. The deafening blast of the truck diesel engine and the harsh grind of its massive tires against the asphalt surged through the open crack in my window. The mechanical roar entirely drowned out Charles and his blustering threats. His voice was swallowed by the sound of actual commerce, of real movement, of a world functioning completely independent of his fragile ego. As the semi-truck pulled ahead, leaving me in its turbulent wake, the cabin quieted down just enough for me to hear Charles demanding a response. "Are you listening to me, Victoria?" he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. I gripped the steering wheel, feeling a profound, unshakable sense of power wash over me. I am no longer your safety net, I said. I pressed the red icon on the touchscreen, terminating the connection instantly. I did not stop there. I immediately accessed my carrier settings and blocked both of their phone numbers, ensuring the resulting hurricane of their panic would crash against an impenetrable digital wall. The highway opened up before me, illuminated by the rising sun. The skyline of New Orleans began to emerge in the distance, a breathtaking silhouette of opportunity rising above the marsh. I had cut off their funding, forcing them to face the financial ruin Savannah was accelerating. But as the towering buildings of the city came into view, I knew men like Charles did not accept defeat gracefully. Deprived of their immediate punching bag, they would inevitably launch a reconnaissance mission to find my weak points. My new life was just beginning, but the hunt to drag me back into the swamp was already underway. The port of New Orleans was a beast that never slept, and I eagerly threw myself directly into its roaring jaws. After a lifetime of walking on eggshells in a quiet Baton Rouge mansion, the deafening symphony of maritime trade felt like a bizarre kind of sanctuary. The air tasted of salt, diesel fuel, and raw ambition. My steel-toed boots hit the concrete docks every morning at 6. The Mississippi River churned with brown silt as cargo ships the size of city blocks glided toward the terminals. My official title was Maritime Logistics Coordinator, but my actual responsibility was untangling complex supply chain knots before they could strangle the local economy. I tracked shipping containers arriving from across the globe, routed freight trains through the dense industrial corridors, and managed the chaotic schedules of hundreds of weary truck drivers. I traded the psychological warfare of my family for a world where outcomes were measured in tonnage and delivery times. There was no room for manipulation on the wharf. You either moved the cargo efficiently, or you found a new line of work. My guide through this gritty landscape was a veteran dock manager named Antoine. He was a man carved from weathered mahogany and harbor grit, wearing a faded high-visibility vest like a suit of armor. Antoine valued precision above all other traits and possessed zero tolerance for office politics. During my first week, he tested me by dropping a disastrous delayed shipping manifest on my desk. I stayed 3 hours past my shift, cross-referencing tariff codes and rerouting the shipment through an alternate rail yard. When I handed him the corrected file, he did not offer a warm smile or excessive praise. He simply nodded, poured me a cup of bitter chicory coffee, and handed me my next assignment. That silent nod was worth more to me than any hollow compliment Charles had ever offered. Antoine became a true mentor, teaching me how to steer my own ship in a harbor full of sharks. My other pillar of support was Elise, a brilliant customs broker who navigated federal trade regulations with the grace of a seasoned dancer. Elise wore sharp-tailored blazers and possessed a wit that could cut through solid steel. We bonded over quick lunches of shrimp sandwiches on the wooden piers, watching the tugboats push barges against the heavy river current. She understood the unique challenge of being a driven woman in an industry dominated by rough men. Elise became my anchor in the city, providing the grounded friendship I had never experienced back home. For the first time in 22 years, I was surrounded by a chosen family that recognized my dedication rather than exploiting my utility. However, peace is a fragile commodity when you are dealing with people who thrive on chaos. My parents had been blocked on all digital fronts, but the Jackson family operated like a well-funded intelligence agency. Deprived of direct contact, Charles dispatched his most reliable scout to locate my weak points. A month into my new career, Antoine handed me a specialized project. The Port Authority was developing a subsidized housing initiative designed to help essential dock workers live closer to the terminals. The initiative required finding and purchasing dilapidated properties to renovate. Antoine trusted my analytical skills, assigning me to scout potential real estate acquisitions in the struggling neighborhoods flanking the industrial canal. The assignment brought me to a decaying stretch of the Bywater district on a stifling Tuesday afternoon. The Louisiana sun beat down on the cracked, uneven pavement. I stood on the sidewalk, holding a clipboard, reviewing structural blueprints with a city real estate agent. We were evaluating a 3-story brick condo complex that had seen better days decades ago. The roofline sagged in a defeated curve. The lower windows were boarded up with cheap plywood, and wild, overgrown weeds choked the rusted chain-link fence surrounding the property. Paint peeled off the siding in long gray strips. It was an eyesore, but the underlying foundation was solid concrete. As I jotted down notes regarding the plumbing infrastructure, a pristine silver luxury sport utility vehicle crept slowly down the ruined street. Its tires crunched over broken glass and loose gravel. The vehicle rolled to a stop directly in front of me, idling with a soft, expensive purr. The tinted passenger window glided down, revealing the impeccably styled face of Aunt Patty. Patty was the older sister of my mother and the undisputed gossip queen of the Baton Rouge Country Club circuit. She wore oversized designer sunglasses and a silk scarf draped perfectly over her shoulders. The contrast between her sterile, air-conditioned luxury vehicle and the grimy, neglected street was stark. She pulled her sunglasses down the bridge of her nose, her eyes scanning the crumbling brick building behind me, then drifting down to my practical work clothes. "Victoria," she cooed, her voice dripping with thick, honeyed condescension. "Look at you, honey." She had found me. The scout had located her target. I lowered my clipboard, keeping my expression entirely neutral. "Hello, Patty. What brings you to this side of the parish? I was worried sick about you," she replied, clutching her leather steering wheel. "Your mother is just devastated, and now seeing you here in this awful place." I realized instantly what she was assuming. Patty saw me standing in front of a ruined, boarded-up condo complex with a real estate agent. She saw my faded denim and work boots. In her mind, I was not a corporate coordinator leading a multi-million-dollar housing acquisition. I was a broke, desperate runaway, trying to rent a squalid apartment because I could not survive without my father financing my life. It was a brilliant, accidental red herring. "You do not have to live in squalor," Victoria Patty continued, her voice swelling with fake pity that barely concealed her genuine glee. "Family is everything. You just need to swallow your pride, come home, and apologize to your sister. I am sure Charles will help you get back on your feet, if you show a little remorse." She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and extended her manicured hand out the window. "Buy yourself a decent meal, sweetheart. You look so thin." I looked at the crumpled currency fluttering in the humid breeze. Correcting her would have been easy. I could have flashed my corporate badge, explained the port initiative, and wiped that smug satisfaction right off her face. But doing so would only prove that I still cared about their validation. More importantly, it would reveal my true strength. Sun Tzu taught that all warfare is based on deception. When you are strong, you must appear weak. I did not take the money. I offered a tight, polite smile. "Keep your cash, Patty. I am exactly where I need to be right now." Patty sighed dramatically, withdrawing her hand. She lifted her smartphone and overtly snapped a photograph of me standing in front of the peeling brick wall. "Suit yourself, Victoria, but pride does not pay the rent." The silver window rolled up, sealing her back in her climate-controlled bubble. I watched the luxury vehicle speed away, knowing exactly what was about to happen. Patty was dialing Charles before she even reached the nearest intersection. She was gleefully transmitting the photograph, reporting that the prodigal daughter was destitute, struggling, and living in a crumbling ruin. Back in Baton Rouge, that phone call served as a soothing balm to my father. Charles became incredibly smug and complacent. The report validated his entire worldview. He firmly believed I was starving in the gutter, proving his theory that I was nothing without his name. Because he thought I was already suffering, he called off the hunt. He stopped trying to track my bank accounts. He stopped threatening my former landlord. He simply sat back in his leather recliner, poured a glass of scotch, and waited for me to come crawling back for his financial grace. His arrogance bought me precious time. For the next 3 weeks, I operated in total freedom. I finalized the housing acquisition, streamlined 3 major shipping routes, and secured a permanent promotion within the logistics department. My foundation in New Orleans cured into solid stone, while my family rejoiced in an illusion. But Charles, feeling victorious, created a new, unforeseen problem. Savannah thrived on being the center of a crisis. With our parents relaxing into their smug satisfaction, the attention shifted away from her. Savannah realized her audience was shrinking. She needed a villain to maintain her status as the victim, and a sister, quietly starving in the Bywater district, was not dramatic enough. Savannah required a fresh wound. If Charles was not going to destroy my new life, she would have to take matters into her own hands. Sitting in her pristine bedroom, she opened her laptop, typed my name into a professional networking site, and discovered exactly which building I walked into every morning. The red herring had successfully fooled the king, but the princess was preparing to burn down the entire castle. Savannah detested a vacuum. When my father settled into his smug complacency, satisfied by Aunt Patty reporting my supposed poverty, the spotlight shifted away from my sister. She could not tolerate a world where she was not the primary victim of a tragedy. The narrative of me starving in a dilapidated condo was boring to her. It lacked the necessary friction to fuel her daily complaints. She needed me to be an active threat, a tangible enemy she could heroically endure. So she went hunting. My digital footprint was sparse, but I had recently updated my professional networking profile to reflect my new title at the Port of New Orleans. It took Savannah exactly 3 minutes to locate my department, the corporate hierarchy of the Maritime Division, and the direct phone line for the Human Resources Director. She did not call to yell or hurl insults. Yelling could be dismissed as a petty sibling rivalry. Instead, she weaponized her greatest talent, the performance of fragile, heartbreaking concern. It was a Thursday morning. I sat at my dual-monitor workstation tracking a shipment of imported steel piping meant for a major offshore drilling project. The logistics software glowed with green and amber routing lines, a complex web of commerce that I controlled with precise keystrokes. The air in the dispatch center smelled of stale coffee and ozone from the heavy-duty laser printers. I was in my element, steering the chaos into orderly rows of digital data. Then my desk phone chimed. It was the administrative assistant for Marcus Thorne, the Director of Human Resources. She requested my presence on the top floor immediately. A summons to the executive floor was rarely a casual invitation. I locked my screen, smoothed the wrinkles from my tailored trousers, and took the elevator up. The executive suite was a stark contrast to the gritty energy of the dispatch floor. Thick carpet muffled my footsteps. The air was chilled to a precise 70 degrees. I walked into Marcus's office, a sprawling room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the muddy Mississippi River. Marcus sat behind a heavy oak desk. He was a stern, meticulous man who handled labor disputes and corporate compliance with equal intensity. Sitting in the leather guest chair across from him was Antoine, my mentor. Antoine's jaw was clenched tight, his arms crossed over his faded, high-visibility vest. The atmosphere in the room was dense, charged with an unsaid accusation. "Please take a seat," Victoria Marcus said, gesturing to the empty chair next to Antoine. His tone was professional, but heavily guarded. "We received a highly concerning telephone call this morning regarding your employment status and your background clearance." I sat down, keeping my spine perfectly straight. I did not fidget. "Who called?" Marcus pressed a button on his desktop speaker. I did not need to guess. The audio filled the quiet office, and the grating theatrical pitch of my sister's voice washed over me. Savannah was weeping. It was not a genuine cry, but a practiced, breathless stutter designed to elicit maximum sympathy. She was speaking to the receptionist on the recording, begging to be connected to someone in charge. When Marcus answered the transferred call, Savannah launched into her script. She introduced herself as my loving, desperate older sister. She claimed our family was terrified for my well-being. She spun a fabricated tale of my supposed mental breakdown, insisting I had fled Baton Rouge in a manic episode because the pressure of adulthood was too much for my fragile psyche. Then came the poison pill. I know she handles sensitive cargo logs, Savannah sobbed through the speaker, pausing to simulate a jagged intake of breath. I have to warn you. She has a history of taking things that do not belong to her. She stole from our grandfather's estate before she left. She is unstable. Please, you need to conduct a wellness check and remove her from those systems before she compromises your operations. We just want her to get the psychiatric help she desperately needs. Marcus stopped the recording. The silence in the office was deafening. He steepled his fingers, watching my face for a reaction. He expected panic. He expected me to crumble into tears, to deny the allegations with frantic, terrified energy. I did not give Savannah the satisfaction of my fear, even in absentia. I felt a cold, crystalline clarity settle over my mind. My heart rate remained steady. The emotional manipulation that used to freeze me in my tracks no longer worked, because I was no longer playing her game. I opened my leather portfolio, the one I carried to every executive meeting. Tucked inside the interior pocket was a thick manila folder labeled Evidence. I had started compiling it the day I signed my lease in the Lower Garden District. It contained every erratic text message Savannah had sent before I blocked her, printed out with clear timestamps and dates. It contained the transcribed voicemails from Charles, including the explicit recording where he threatened to call my bosses and ruin my career if I refused to pay my sister's automotive insurance. I slid the folder across the polished oak desk. I apologize for the disruption to your morning, Marcus, I said, my voice steady and measured. What you just listened to is retaliation. My family is currently experiencing significant financial distress due to my sister's chronic mismanagement. I removed myself as their financial safety net last month. The documents in that folder will provide the necessary context. Specifically, page 4 contains a transcribed voicemail from my father, explicitly threatening to sabotage my employment here if I did not wire them funds. Marcus opened the folder. He read the first page, his brow furrowing. He flipped to the second, then the third. His eyes scanned the exact words Charles had bellowed into the phone while I was driving down the highway. The stern mask on his face shifted into an expression of grim understanding. He realized instantly that he was not speaking to a concerned sibling, but an extortionist. Antoine leaned forward, placing his large, calloused hands on his knees. I will tell you this once, Marcus Antoine rumbled, his voice thick with harbor grit. Victoria is the most precise, disciplined coordinator I have seen on that floor in a decade. She caught a billing error yesterday that saved this port $30,000. She does not steal. She fixes what other people break. I stake my own reputation on her integrity. The endorsement from a veteran of the docks was the final nail in the coffin of Savannah's fabricated tragedy. Antoine did not hand out praise lightly. His word carried profound weight in that building. Marcus closed the manila folder and slid it back toward me. I appreciate your transparency, Victoria, Marcus stated, his tone shifting from guarded suspicion to professional solidarity. The Port Authority does not involve itself in the domestic disputes of our employees, nor do we entertain intimidation tactics. I will instruct building security to flag this phone number. Any future correspondence from your relatives will be routed directly to our legal department and classified as harassment. You may return to your desk. I thanked them both and stood up. I walked out of the executive suite, leaving the plush carpet for the hard tile of the hallway. The sabotage had failed spectacularly. Savannah had swung a sledgehammer, hoping to shatter my glass house, only to discover I had built a fortress of steel. But as the elevator descended back to the dispatch floor, a profound realization hardened in my chest. This was no longer just petty household bickering over a canceled party or a borrowed vintage truck. My family was actively attempting to sever my income. They wanted me destitute, humiliated, and desperate enough to crawl back into their swamp. The stakes had elevated from emotional manipulation to active professional warfare. I realized then that defense was no longer a sufficient strategy. If they were willing to attack my livelihood, they had forfeited any right to my mercy. I returned to my workstation and stared at the glowing monitors. My tracking software was updating in real time, pulling data from cargo manifests across the Gulf. My family wanted to play games with my career. They wanted to disrupt my supply chain. It was a dangerous strategy considering I now possessed the tools to monitor the flow of commerce for the entire region. As I typed my password and unlocked my screen, a strange discrepancy flashed on the secondary monitor. A minor logistics anomaly flagged by the automated tariff system caught my eye. It was a shipment scheduled to arrive from a holding company I did not recognize, routed through an obscure subsidiary based out of Baton Rouge. I leaned closer to the screen, tracing the digital paper trail. The deeper I dug into the corporate filings of that specific cargo container, the more a familiar, chilling pattern began to emerge. My father believed he could secretly navigate the treacherous waters of international trade to save his sinking finances, unaware that his estranged daughter was the one guarding the gates. The dispatch center hummed with the steady, chaotic rhythm of international commerce. It was late Friday afternoon, and most of the administrative staff had already left to start their weekends. I remained at my workstation, bathed in the cool light of my dual monitors. The logistics software I had recently designed, a streamlined tracking protocol identifying bottlenecks in customs processing, was performing flawlessly. It had already caught the attention of regional directors, resulting in the promotion Aunt Patty had so wrongly assumed I was too destitute to achieve. I enjoyed the quiet focus required to monitor the vast network of freight moving through the Gulf. It was a tangible puzzle devoid of emotional manipulation. But my family had decided to introduce chaos into my sanctuary. Savannah failing to get me fired earlier that week meant the Jackson family was pivoting from emotional warfare to economic desperation. As I reviewed the automated tariff alerts, my new system flagged a minor logistical anomaly. It was a standard procedure, a shipment flagged for inconsistent manifest details. I clicked on the digital file, expecting a simple clerical error, a missing weight certificate, or an outdated import license. The screen displayed a manifest for 20 shipping containers, registered to a holding company I did not immediately recognize. The cargo was listed vaguely as industrial salvage, originating from a port in Central America. I scrolled down, tracing the digital paper trail. The holding company was a subsidiary. I clicked further, peeling back the layers of corporate ownership. The subsidiary was owned by a mid-sized maritime logistics firm based in Baton Rouge, a firm that happened to be a direct failing competitor to the Port Authority. A firm Charles had frequently criticized at the dinner table, condemning their sloppy operations and desperate business practices. Why was a shipment tied to a struggling Baton Rouge firm triggering high alert flags on my screen? I accessed the public records database, cross-referencing the corporate officers of the subsidiary. The name on the screen made my blood run cold. Charles Jackson. He was listed as a primary investor, having recently acquired a significant stake in the struggling enterprise. The pieces clicked together with terrifying clarity. Charles was hemorrhaging money trying to maintain Savannah's luxury lifestyle and the facade of our Baton Rouge estate. The parish property taxes were just the tip of the iceberg. Desperate to generate rapid cash flow, he had bypassed his usual conservative investments. He had secretly leveraged his assets, gambling on a failing maritime competitor, hoping a quick influx of imported goods would yield a massive return. He had entered my arena. The 20 containers currently sitting in Terminal 4 were the lifeline Charles desperately needed. The holding company was attempting to push the shipment through customs, rapidly bypassing standard inspection protocols, using an obscure commercial loophole. They were trying to slip undocumented, potentially illegal cargo through my port to secure Charles his financial bailout. I stared at the glowing beacon on my monitor. The cargo containers represented a massive investment. If they cleared customs, Charles would secure enough capital to pay off Savannah's debts, cover the property taxes, and continue his reign of toxic control. Our professional worlds had collided with absolute precision. My father had unknowingly placed his entire financial future into a digital system overseen by the daughter he had just tried to ruin. I rested my fingers on the keyboard. A heavy, profound stillness settled over me. This was the moment of ultimate leverage. I held the power to destroy his bailout with a few keystrokes. A lesser person might have acted out of spite, fueled by the memory of the stolen vintage truck or the canceled graduation party. They might have flagged the containers simply to inflict pain. But I was not Charles. I did not operate on vindictive impulses. I operated on procedure precision and the unwavering application of the law. The manifest was incomplete. The holding company was utilizing a suspicious loophole. The cargo description was deliberately vague. According to the strict regulations enforced by the Port Authority and federal customs, those containers required a full physical audit. It was not a choice governed by emotion, it was a mandate governed by compliance. I did not hesitate. I initiated the security protocol. I typed a formal mandate into the digital log. Cargo manifest incomplete. Suspicion of undocumented goods. Initiating full Tier 3 customs audit. Freezing assets pending federal inspection. I hit the enter key. The glowing green beacon on my monitor instantly shifted to a harsh, pulsing red. The digital command transmitted immediately to the customs officers on the docks. I imagined the heavy steel chains securing the massive metal doors of the 20 containers, effectively locking Charles's investment in bureaucratic purgatory. A Tier 3 audit would take weeks, possibly months to resolve. The holding company would face massive fines, and the cargo would likely be seized if any irregularities were discovered. I did not flag the shipment because he was my father. I flagged it because he broke the rules. But the consequence of my compliance was absolute. By freezing those assets, I had severed his financial lifeline. Charles's desperate gamble collapsed in real time. The investment he had leveraged his estate against was now a toxic liability. The hurricane of debt he and Valerie had generated by coddling Savannah was no longer a distant storm. It was making landfall directly on their doorstep. I closed the logistics software and locked my workstation. I picked up my leather portfolio and walked toward the elevator. The dispatch floor was quiet, the week's chaos finally settling into a low murmur. I had done my job perfectly, protecting the port from illegal commerce. But as the elevator doors closed, carrying me down to the lobby, I knew the silence would not last. Charles would receive the notification regarding the frozen assets within the hour. He would realize the logistics coordinator who ordered the audit shared his last name. The fragile illusion of his control was shattered. He had tried to crush my independence, and in doing so, he had handed me the exact tool required to finalize his ruin. The battle had officially shifted from the digital realm to a desperate struggle for survival. And desperate people, as I had learned, were capable of profound violations. I stepped out into the humid New Orleans evening. The streetlights flickered to life, casting long shadows over the pavement. My career was secure, my foundation solid. But I knew the Jackson family, having exhausted their financial resources and their patience, would soon realize they had only one card left to play. They would have to confront me directly. The fortress I had built in the city was about to face a physical siege. Despite the colossal financial earthquake I had just triggered on the dispatch floor, my weekend arrived with a profound, unbroken stillness. New Orleans is a city that thrives on loud celebrations, yet it also harbors deeply hidden tranquil pockets of refuge. My apartment in the Lower Garden District had become one of those sacred spaces. I had spent the past few months transforming the empty, exposed brick unit into a curated fortress. Sunlight poured through the tall, arched windows, casting warm, golden rectangles across the reclaimed hardwood floors. Unlike the sprawling mansion in Baton Rouge, which was suffocated by Valerie and her ostentatious artificial floral arrangements, and Charles with his heavy, imposing mahogany furniture, my space felt organic. It breathed. I had adorned the walls with vibrant canvases painted by local French Quarter artists, depicting the untamed beauty of the bayou. Lush ferns hung from the high ceiling, their green fronds swaying gently whenever the ceiling fan rotated. Every single object in this dwelling belonged to me, purchased with my own wages, positioned exactly where I desired. There was no walking on eggshells here. There was no waiting for the next manufactured crisis to shatter the calm. For the first 2 decades of my existence, my nervous system operated in a perpetual state of hypervigilance. The Baton Rouge house was a theater of anxiety. I was trained to listen for the specific cadence of my father, tracing his heavy footsteps, or the sharp theatrical pitch of my sister complaining about a broken fingernail. Now the soundtrack of my life consisted of the distant mournful blow of tugboat horns, echoing off the Mississippi River, and the soft rustle of palm leaves brushing against my wrought iron balcony. The contrast between my chaotic past and this beautiful, intentional present was staggering. I had built a life that did not require my constant emotional sacrifice to sustain itself. Sunday morning arrived cloaked in a thick, comforting humidity. I stepped out onto my balcony, holding a ceramic mug of dark chicory coffee. The wrought iron railing felt cool beneath my fingertips. Arrayed across a small wooden potting bench were several terracotta pots, a bag of rich potting soil, and a small gardening trowel. Resting in the center of the bench was a struggling pothos plant I had rescued from a discount bin at a local nursery a few weeks prior. Its leaves were yellowing at the edges, the stems drooping with a weary, defeated posture. I set my coffee mug aside and gently grasped the base of the plant. Turning the cheap plastic nursery container upside down, I tapped the bottom until the root ball slid free. The sight was a tragic display of confinement. The thick white roots were entirely bound, wrapping around themselves in a tight, desperate spiral. They had outgrown their vessel long ago, choking each other in a frantic search for nourishment that simply did not exist within those rigid plastic walls. The plant was suffocating in its own foundation. I sat on a small stool and began the meticulous process of untangling the roots. My fingertips dug into the compacted dirt, slowly and methodically teasing the fragile fibers apart. I did not rush. Ripping them would cause permanent damage. They needed gentle, persistent pressure to unlearn the restrictive shape they had been forced into. As the soil crumbled away, falling onto the wooden bench, a profound sense of recognition washed over me. I was holding a mirror to my own history. For 22 years, my family had kept me root-bound. They restricted my growth, forcing me to twist and fold myself into whatever shape served their immediate needs. They demanded I stay small, contained within the strict parameters of their toxic ecosystem. They wanted me tangled in their drama, unable to stretch outward or seek my own sunlight. I carefully placed the liberated plant into a much larger, spacious terracotta pot, packing fresh, nutrient-dense soil around its newly freed base. Giving it room to breathe triggered a vivid memory of a much larger, far more significant root system. 3 hours north, standing majestic and defiant in the front yard of my grandfather and his Baton Rouge estate, was an ancient magnolia tree. That tree was a towering monument of Southern heritage. Its sprawling branches shaded the entire wraparound porch, and its thick, gnarled roots gripped the earth with an unshakable strength. My grandfather had planted it the day he purchased the property. Charles despised that tree. He viewed it as a nuisance, constantly complaining about the thick leaves it dropped across his manicured lawn. Last summer, during one of Savannah and her endless campaigns for a more glamorous lifestyle, she had whined about wanting a sprawling resort-style swimming pool in the front yard to host her superficial friends. Charles, ever eager to appease his golden child, had stood on the porch with a contractor, casually pointing at the ancient magnolia. He declared he would bring a crew in to chop it down, rip out the stump, and pour a concrete deck over the soil. He spoke about destroying a century of history as if he were simply discarding an old piece of furniture. I watered the newly potted pothos on my balcony, watching the dry soil eagerly drink the moisture. I remembered standing on that porch, listening to Charles discuss the chainsaw rental, feeling a cold, silent rage crystallize in my chest. He believed he possessed the authority to raze that land. He operated under the assumption that the property was his kingdom to alter, destroy, and leverage as he saw fit. He did not know about the civil law loophole. He did not know I held the naked ownership deed locked safely in a safety deposit box. I wiped the damp soil from my hands using a cotton rag, looking out over the vibrant, waking city of New Orleans. I made a silent, unbreakable vow to the ghost of my grandfather. The axe would never touch that magnolia bark. Charles would never pour a concrete pool over those ancient roots. I had already frozen his illegal cargo at the port, cutting off the exact funds he intended to use for his foolish renovations, and Savannah and her mounting debts. The financial guillotine had dropped. The calm of my balcony felt incredibly sweet, but it also served to highlight the severe impending tension. The peaceful Sunday morning was the quiet retreat of the tide before a devastating tsunami makes landfall. Charles and Valerie were currently staring at bank accounts frozen by federal audits. Savannah was facing a mountain of retail debt with no parental bailout arriving to save her. Their credit cards were bouncing. Their social standing was crumbling. The illusion they had sacrificed my graduation to protect was evaporating into thin air. When predators are cornered, they do not surrender gracefully. They lash out. They seek the easiest prey to devour for their own survival. I knew they were currently scrambling, realizing the daughter they had chased away was the only person capable of fixing their shattered reality. They had exhausted their funds, their patience, and their pride. Desperate people were capable of staggering boundary violations. My sanctuary was secure, but the physical distance between Baton Rouge and New Orleans was closing rapidly. The siege was no longer a theoretical threat. They were coming, and they were bringing their hurricane directly to my front door. The humid Friday evening settled over New Orleans like a heavy woven blanket. I had just returned to my apartment in the Lower Garden District after a punishing 60-hour week at the dispatch center. The port never slept, but I had successfully orchestrated the reroute of 3 major cargo freighters, navigating a logistical nightmare with cool precision. My sanctuary was quiet. I poured a glass of iced tea, the condensation weeping down the sides of the crystal tumbler, and stood by the open balcony doors. The distant, soulful notes of a jazz trumpet drifted over from Magazine Street, mixing with the scent of jasmine blooming in the courtyard below. I felt a profound sense of grounded stability, but true stability always attracts parasites. The financial guillotine I dropped on Charles a few days prior had executed its task with ruthless efficiency. By freezing his illicit cargo at the terminal, his liquidity evaporated overnight. The Baton Rouge Country Club circuit operates on a strict, unforgiving currency of appearances. Bounced checks and declined credit cards spread through those manicured subdivisions faster than a swamp fire. For years, Savannah resided in a sprawling luxury penthouse overlooking the university lakes. Her rent was astronomical, quietly covered by Charles and his discreet monthly transfers. With his assets locked in customs purgatory, the property management company did not care about the Jackson family legacy or their supposed prestige. They cared about cleared funds. When the eviction notice was pinned to Savannah's pristine front door, Charles and Valerie faced a catastrophic dilemma. They could not move her back into the grandfather's estate. Doing so would signal a public admission of defeat to their judgmental social circle. It would confirm the whispers that their golden child was a failure and their empire was crumbling. They needed a scapegoat to hide her. They needed a dumping ground for their most expensive liability. They needed me. A heavy, rhythmic pounding echoed through my quiet apartment. It was not a polite tap or a neighborly knock. It was an authoritative demand, the sound of a fist striking wood with sheer entitlement. I set my glass down on the coffee table. My pulse remained steady. The phantom anxiety that used to paralyze me in their presence was entirely gone, replaced by a quiet, calculating strength. I walked to the front foyer and pressed my eye against the brass peephole. The distorted fisheye lens revealed a sight I had anticipated, yet I still found it breathtaking in its sheer audacity. Charles stood in the center of the dim apartment corridor. The air conditioning in the hallway was running, but he was sweating profusely. His rumpled linen suit hung awkwardly on his frame, lacking its usual crisp, tailored authority. Valerie hovered anxiously behind his left shoulder, clutching her designer handbag tight against her chest like a protective shield. Flanking them on the patterned carpet were 4 enormous hard-shell designer suitcases, and leaning against the painted drywall entirely detached from the humiliating reality of her own eviction was Savannah. She was staring down at her glowing smartphone screen, her thumbs swiping rhythmically across the glass. She looked incredibly bored, chewing a piece of pink gum. She did not look like a woman who had just lost her home. She looked like a spoiled passenger waiting in a first-class lounge for her flight to board. I unfastened the brass chain and pulled the heavy wooden door open. I did not step aside to invite them in. I stood firmly in the center of the threshold, filling the space, creating an immovable human barrier. Charles cleared his throat, attempting to project his usual booming authority, but his vocal cords betrayed a faint tremor of desperation. "Your sister needs a fresh start," he announced, gesturing broadly toward the mountain of luggage. "The scene in Baton Rouge is too toxic for her mental health right now. People are being incredibly uncharitable. She will take your spare room until she gets back on her feet." He did not ask how I was doing. He did not apologize for threatening my career. He did not acknowledge the sheer insanity of driving 80 miles down the interstate to force their favorite burden onto the daughter they had spent a lifetime diminishing. He issued a directive fully expecting me to step aside and transform my hard-won sanctuary into Savannah's personal playground. The physical violation of this boundary was staggering. They expected to infect my clean, peaceful life with their chronic chaos. I looked past Charles and observed my sister. Savannah still did not look up from her phone. A soft pop echoed in the hallway as she blew a small bubble with her gum. She assumed her mere presence was a gift I was obligated to accommodate. She expected me to carry her suitcases inside, prepare the guest bed, and resume my historical role as her silent, resentful servant. I shifted my weight, planting my boots firmly against the hardwood floor. I looked Charles directly in the eyes, stripping away decades of conditioned obedience. "This is not a hotel," I stated. My voice was quiet, devoid of anger, but forged with the unbreakable density of cold iron. Valerie gasped, a sharp, dramatic intake of air. Her manicured hand flew up to rest against the string of pearls at her throat. "Victoria, you cannot be serious," she scolded. Her tone, a mix of manufactured shock and authentic panic. "She is your family. She has nowhere else to go tonight. We know you have a second bedroom just sitting empty in there. You are being unbelievably cruel." I stared at my mother, noting the deep stress lines framing her mouth. They were crumbling, and they expected me to become their structural support. "I have a sanctuary," I corrected her, keeping my gaze locked on Charles. "And you are currently trespassing." Charles stepped forward, his face flushing a deep, furious crimson. "Now you listen to me," he growled, pointing a thick finger toward my face. "You owe this family. You will open this door, or I swear to God—" "You have 3 seconds to remove those bags from my property line," I interrupted, cutting off his threat with surgical precision. "If you are still standing here when I finish counting, I will call building security and have you all escorted out. If you resist them, I will have the New Orleans Police Department arrest you for trespassing." The hallway went dead silent. The threat of police involvement of a public scene that would inevitably end up on a police blotter for their country club friends to discover paralyzed them both. One I stated. Charles stood frozen, his jaw working furiously as he tried to formulate a response that would salvage his shattered pride. 2. Savannah finally looked up from her smartphone. Her eyes went wide with sudden, genuine shock. The screen illuminated her face, highlighting the dawning realization that her protective bubble had just burst. She had never heard anyone deny her anything in her entire 25 years of existence. The concept of a closed door was entirely foreign to her. 3. I did not wait for them to grab the handles of their luggage. I gripped the edge of the heavy wooden door and slammed it shut. The frame shuddered upon impact, a booming percussion that echoed down the quiet corridor. I reached up and turned the brass deadbolt. The metal slid into place with a heavy, satisfying thud. I stood in my quiet foyer, listening to the muffled, frantic whispers seeping through the wood. Valerie was crying. Charles was pacing, his heavy footsteps retreating down the hall. Savannah was complaining about the heat. I turned my back to the door and walked into my living room, the distant jazz trumpet still playing its sweet, triumphant melody through the open balcony windows. The physical boundary was established, and the fortress had held its ground against the siege. But as I poured the rest of my iced tea into the sink, I knew the war was far from over. Charles was a man who required the final word. Being locked out of an apartment by the daughter he deemed worthless would trigger a catastrophic ego injury. His pride was fatally wounded, and cornered animals always resort to their most extreme tactics. He could no longer control my physical space, and he could no longer control my income. Tomorrow morning he would attempt to leverage the only weapon he believed he still held over my head. He would reach into the past and try to use generational wealth to force my submission, entirely unaware that he was about to step onto a legal landmine. Saturday morning broke over the Lower Garden District with a brilliant, unapologetic clarity. The severe adrenaline from the previous evening had completely metabolized out of my system, leaving behind a pristine, crystalline focus. I stood in my kitchen, listening to the rhythmic drip of my coffee maker brewing, a dark, robust chicory blend. The apartment was entirely peaceful. There were no lingering echoes of Charles bellowing in the hallway, no phantom sounds of Valerie weeping, and certainly no trace of Savannah and her endless luggage. My deadbolt had held firm against the physical siege. I poured the steaming dark liquid into a ceramic mug, watching a splash of heavy cream bloom into pale swirling clouds. The physical boundary was established, but I knew my father too well to believe the war was over. Charles was a man whose entire identity was built on the foundation of ultimate authority. Being denied entry, having a door quite literally slammed in his face by the daughter he considered subordinate, constituted a catastrophic psychological injury. He could not process defeat. Instead, he would retreat, calculate, and launch a retaliatory strike designed to completely obliterate my defiance. I took a slow sip of the bitter, earthy coffee, enjoying the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Right on cue, the digital display of my smartphone illuminated on the kitchen counter. A visual voicemail notification popped onto the screen. It was a blocked number, bypassing my caller identification software by routing through an automated switchboard. Charles had likely commandeered a phone from an administrative assistant at his failing firm, just to bypass my digital barricades. Before I could even press play, a sharp, authoritative knock sounded at my front door. It was not the frantic, entitled pounding from the night before. It was measured and professional. I walked to the foyer, checking the brass peephole. A uniformed postal carrier stood in the corridor, holding a thick, rigid cardboard envelope and a digital signature pad. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. The carrier offered a polite, tired smile confirming my identity before handing over the electronic stylus. "Certified mail," he stated, requiring a direct signature. I scribbled my name across the digital screen, accepted the heavy envelope, and thanked him. I carried the parcel back to the kitchen island, setting it down next to my coffee mug. The return address, printed in an embossed, arrogant serif font, belonged to a high-powered estate litigation firm based in downtown Baton Rouge. It was the legal counsel Charles retained for his personal affairs. The retaliation had arrived through federal mail. I did not tear into the cardboard immediately. I picked up my smartphone, tapped the voicemail icon, and placed the device on speakerphone. I wanted to hear the performance accompanying the prop. The audio crackled for a fraction of a second before my father projected his voice into the room. He spoke with a slow, deliberate cadence, abandoning the frantic screaming from the highway and the hallway. This was his calculated, patriarchal tone, the voice of a wealthy Southern aristocrat delivering a fatal verdict. "Since you want to act like a stranger, you will be treated like one," Charles declared through the tiny speaker. "You made your choice last night, Victoria. You decided to turn your back on your own blood. You disrespected your mother, and you abandoned your sister when she needed you the most. You think you can build an empire in New Orleans without my backing? But you forget who laid the foundation you walk on." I took another sip of coffee, leaning against the marble counter, letting his monologue wash over the kitchen. "We are officially severing ties," he continued, his tone dripping with weaponized satisfaction. "I have instructed my attorneys to draft the necessary paperwork. We are legally disinheriting you. You will not see a single dime of this family fortune. Furthermore, your grandfather and his waterfront estate will be transferred entirely to Savannah. She understands loyalty. She respects this family. You are cut off, Victoria. Permanently." The voicemail ended with a sharp, synthetic beep. He had played what he firmly believed was his ultimate trump card. The weaponization of generational wealth is the oldest, most reliable tool in the arsenal of a toxic patriarch. When physical intimidation fails and emotional manipulation loses its grip, they threaten your future security. Charles assumed the sheer terror of losing an inheritance, of missing out on a sprawling historic mansion and millions in theoretical assets would shatter my resolve. He expected me to drop the phone, fall to my knees, and desperately beg for his forgiveness. He envisioned me driving frantically back up the interstate, ready to accept Savannah into my home just to secure my place in his last will and testament. I reached for the cardboard envelope, pulled the tab, and slid the documents onto the counter. The letterhead was crisp, the legal jargon dense and intimidating. It outlined a formal declaration of intent to modify the family trust, specifically removing my name as a beneficiary and designating Savannah as the sole heir to the Baton Rouge property. I looked at the aggressive, threatening legal document. I looked at the dark screen of my phone. And then, standing alone in my sunlit kitchen, I smiled. It was a genuine, radiant expression of pure, unadulterated amusement. The dramatic irony of the situation was so profound, so flawlessly constructed, it felt like reading the climax of a brilliant novel. Charles was standing atop a massive legal trapdoor, aggressively pulling the lever himself, entirely unaware of the mechanism beneath his feet. My father operated his entire life, assuming I was a passive, ignorant participant in my own existence. He never bothered to ask what classes I took during my grueling 4 years at the university. He only cared that my grades were high enough to maintain the family image. If he had ever paid a singular ounce of attention, he would have known I utilized every single elective credit I possessed to study the intricate, highly specific nuances of Louisiana civil law. Louisiana does not operate under English common law like the rest of the American Republic. Our legal system is a direct descendant of the Napoleonic Code, heavily influenced by French and Spanish colonial statutes. Property rights here are a completely different animal, specifically regarding inheritance and succession. When my grandfather passed away, Charles naturally assumed the estate transferred directly to him because he was the patriarch, because he paid the property taxes, and because he simply occupied the space. But my grandfather was a shrewd man who saw right through his son and his reckless arrogance. The old man knew Charles would eventually leverage the property, squander its value, or use it to manipulate the family hierarchy. The grandfather executed a very specific estate maneuver unique to our state. He granted Charles and Valerie the usufruct of the property. Usufruct is the legal right to use, occupy, and derive income from an asset, but he did not give them ownership. He bypassed Charles entirely and transferred the naked ownership directly to me. I possessed the roots. Charles only borrowed the shade. Since the day I turned 18, I was the sole legal owner of the waterfront estate. Charles could not disinherit me from a property I already owned. He could not transfer the deed to Savannah because his name was never on the deed to begin with. The letter sitting on my kitchen counter was nothing more than a spectacular, expensive piece of fictional intimidation. He paid a high-priced corporate attorney to draft a threat he had absolutely zero legal authority to execute. The attorney, likely working off false documents Charles provided to avoid a costly title search, was just as ignorant as his client. Charles assumed his bluff would crush my spirit. He believed he was cementing his ultimate authority, entirely oblivious to the fact that usufruct comes with strict, unbreakable obligations. An individual holding a usufruct must maintain the property and pay all associated taxes. If they fail to do so, if they commit waste or abuse the asset, the naked owner holds the absolute right to terminate the usufruct and evict them immediately. And Charles, drowning in Savannah and her endless debt, had just ignored months of final notice property tax bills. I carefully folded the threatening letter, aligning the sharp creases. I walked into my home office, unlocked the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet, and pulled out the thick manila folder clearly labeled evidence. I slid the fake disinheritance letter directly behind the transcribed voicemails and the erratic text messages. The file was growing heavier, accumulating the exact ammunition required for a flawless, decisive victory. I closed the drawer, locked it, and walked back into the kitchen to finish my coffee. My family believed they had successfully exiled me, stripping away my safety net and my future inheritance. They were likely sitting in their cramped Baton Rouge living room, celebrating their hollow triumph, comforting a newly evicted Savannah with promises of a sprawling mansion that would never belong to her. They thought I was destroyed. But while they wallowed in their manufactured victories and impending bankruptcy, My professional trajectory was about to launch me into a spotlight so bright it would illuminate their failures for the entire Gulf Coast to see. The port was preparing to recognize my achievements on a massive scale, and that undeniable public validation was going to draw my desperate family back to me, like moths flying blindly into an open flame. The weeks following my father and his fabricated legal threat moved with a blistering, victorious velocity. While my family stewed in their crumbling Baton Rouge fortress, attempting to manage Savannah and her newfound reality of closed accounts, my professional trajectory ignited. The logistics tracking protocol I had designed evolved from a quiet departmental experiment into the primary nervous system of the entire New Orleans port operation. I had effectively remapped the supply chain. Before my software integration freighters languished at anchor in the Gulf, burning thousands of gallons of idle diesel while waiting for terminal clearance. Truck drivers spent hours idling in snaking lines outside the gates collecting overtime pay while cargoes spoiled or missed critical rail connections. I analyzed the friction points, identified the bureaucratic bottlenecks, and automated the customs handoffs. Within a single financial quarter, my protocol shaved 12 hours off the average turnaround time per vessel. I did not just organize the shipping lanes. I saved the Port Authority nearly $4 million in operational waste. That kind of tangible, undeniable success does not remain hidden in the shadows of a dispatch center for long. The regional directors took notice, and soon after the press followed. The executive editor of the Louisiana Business Journal, a prestigious statewide publication that dictated corporate trends from Shreveport to the French Quarter, contacted my department. They were curating their annual feature on industry innovators and requested an exclusive interview. I spent a Tuesday afternoon standing on the edge of Terminal 6, posing for a professional photographer. The humid river wind whipped through my hair. I wore a sharp-tailored navy suit I had purchased with my own bonus check, standing tall against a backdrop of towering steel cranes and stacked shipping containers. When the issue published the following month, I was not merely mentioned in a passing paragraph. I was given a full 2-page spread. The bold, glossy headline read, "Top 30 Under 30 Innovators in Maritime Trade." Below the stunning photograph of me commanding the wharf, the article detailed my rapid ascent. It outlined the millions of dollars my system salvaged, praised my relentless work ethic, and prominently displayed my new executive title. For the first time in my life, I saw my name printed in heavy black ink, celebrated entirely independent of my family. I was not Charles Jackson and his daughter. I was not Savannah and her quiet, useful shadow. I was Victoria, the architect of my own empire. The morning the magazine hit the newsstands, Elise walked into my office carrying a heavy package wrapped in brown craft paper. She placed it carefully on my glass desk, her eyes bright with genuine pride. "Open it," she demanded, tapping her manicured fingernails against the paper. I tore away the wrapping to reveal the magazine spread beautifully preserved inside a thick mahogany frame with a crisp white mat board. Elise had gone to a custom framer the moment the issue dropped. I traced the edge of the wood, feeling a sudden, unexpected tightness in my throat. My own mother had canceled my graduation party, throwing my paper banner into the trash. Yet this woman, a friend I had known for less than a year, treated my victory like a monument. "You steer your own ship," Elise said softly, echoing the words Antoine had spoken to me on my first day. "Now you have the documentation to prove it. We are hanging this directly behind your chair, so anyone who walks into this office knows exactly who holds the wheel." That framed article became a beacon of my independence, but a beacon shines in all directions. The light it cast inevitably reached the dark, desperate corners of Baton Rouge. I would learn later from a gossiping cousin exactly how the illusion of my poverty shattered. Valerie was sitting in the waiting room of a high-end cosmetic dermatology clinic in Baton Rouge. It was an appointment she could no longer afford, a desperate attempt to maintain her social veneer while her bank accounts bled dry. The waiting room was sterile, smelling of ozone and expensive eucalyptus candles. Valerie reached for a magazine on the glass coffee table to distract herself from the mounting anxiety of her unpaid bills. She picked up the latest issue of the Louisiana Business Journal, likely intending to scan the pages for names of country club acquaintances. She turned a glossy page and froze. Staring back at her was the daughter she had discarded. Valerie read the headline. She absorbed the photograph of me looking powerful, wealthy, and untouchable. Her eyes darted down to the text, hungrily consuming the details of my promotion, the port revenue I had saved, and the unmistakable implication of my new corporate salary bracket. In that sterile waiting room, the narrative shifted with a violent, jarring force. For months, Aunt Patty and her sneaky photograph of the rundown condo had insulated my parents in a cocoon of smug superiority. They genuinely believed I was starving in a crumbling apartment, counting pennies, regretting the day I defied them. They thought my return was imminent. Looking at the two-page spread, Valerie realized they had been masterfully played. I was never inspecting that dilapidated building as a desperate tenant. I was standing there as a corporate buyer. The red herring had worked perfectly, shielding my growth until I was too large to contain. Valerie did not stay for her appointment. She dropped the magazine into her designer handbag, rushed out the glass doors, and drove erratically back to the estate. She slammed the publication onto Charles and his mahogany desk in his home study. The revelation hit my father like a physical blow. His secret maritime investment was frozen at my port, bleeding his reserves dry. Savannah was weeping in the guest bedroom, demanding funds he no longer possessed. The property taxes were delinquent, and the walls of his carefully constructed kingdom were caving in. And suddenly, staring at the glossy page, I was no longer the stubborn, useless sister. I was transformed into a lucrative asset. I was a shiny trophy they could parade in front of their judgmental friends to prove the Jackson family was still generating success. More importantly, my new executive salary represented a potential financial bailout for their impending bankruptcy. If they could just bring me back into the fold, if they could just manipulate me into seeking their approval one last time, they could access my resources and save themselves. The panic in the Baton Rouge house shifted into a frantic, predatory calculation. They knew they could not simply call my phone, as the numbers remained blocked. They could not show up at my apartment, terrified of facing another humiliating lockout and the threat of police intervention. They needed a stage. They required a venue where the rules of Southern polite society would force me to play along. A place where I would be too embarrassed to cause a scene. They found their perfect trap printed in the final paragraph of my magazine feature. The article concluded by stating that my achievements would be formally honored at the upcoming Port Authority Maritime Trade Gala, an exclusive high society event hosted in the heart of the French Quarter. The publication provided the date, the venue, and the guarantee of my presence. My family realized they had one final opportunity to hijack my narrative and reassert their dominance. They began planning their infiltration, brushing off their outdated formal wear and leveraging whatever twisted connections Aunt Patty still possessed to secure entry. They were preparing to drag their toxic swamp directly into my pristine ballroom, setting the stage for a public collision that would either break my spirit or destroy their legacy forever. The Maritime Trade Gala was an event woven from equal parts old Southern money and the raw, unyielding power of industrial commerce. Hosted in a sprawling historic venue deep within the French Quarter, the ballroom was a spectacle of crystal chandeliers, casting fractured light over polished parquet floors. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered sweeping views of the Mississippi River, where the dark silhouettes of cargo ships glided silently against the nighttime sky. The air hummed with a specific kind of energy, the low, steady vibration of multi-million-dollar deals being negotiated over imported oysters and top-shelf bourbon. This was my arena. I stood near the center of the room, wearing a striking emerald green evening gown that flowed like water over the polished wood. Elise stood to my left, radiant in a structured crimson dress, while Antoine occupied my right, looking surprisingly distinguished in a tailored black tuxedo that barely contained his broad shoulders. We were surrounded by a small, influential orbit of port commissioners, shipping magnates, and regional directors. They were eager to discuss the tracking protocol that had earned my face a 2-page spread in the Louisiana Business Journal. For the first time in 22 years, I was not standing in the shadow of my sister or the suffocating expectations of my parents. I was the focal point, the architect of a system that was currently revolutionizing the Gulf Coast economy. But a fortress is only secure until an infiltrator finds a sympathetic guard at the gate. My Aunt Patty possessed a unique, terrifying skill set. She was a woman who navigated high society not through genuine wealth, but through a masterful manipulation of social obligations and a ruthless exploitation of appearances. When Valerie rushed to Patty clutching the magazine and weeping about their impending bankruptcy, Patty saw an opportunity to play the savior. She purchased a lower-tier sponsor table for the gala, a transaction completed entirely on credit, specifically to bypass the rigorous security checkpoints. She smuggled Charles, Valerie, and Savannah into the venue, passing them off as esteemed corporate guests. I did not notice them immediately. The ballroom was dense and music a lively jazz ensemble that masked the sound of their approach. The first indication that my sanctuary had been breached was a sharp, grating laugh that sliced through the sophisticated murmur of the crowd. It was Savannah. I turned my head slightly, my gaze sweeping past a group of international delegates. My heart rate experienced a singular heavy spike before settling into a cold, rhythmic thud. There, standing near the oyster bar, was the Jackson family. They looked like ghosts attempting to haunt a mansion they no longer owned. Charles wore a tuxedo that was a decade out of style, the fabric slightly shiny at the elbows, his posture rigid with an outdated, desperate arrogance. Valerie clung to his arm, her smile tight and brittle, wearing a pastel gown that felt entirely inappropriate for the evening's dark, industrial elegance. Savannah was the most glaring anomaly. She wore a dress that belonged at a college formal, shimmering and overly revealing, holding a glass of champagne and aggressively flirting with 2 junior logistics analysts who looked entirely bewildered by her sudden attention. They had invaded my summit. They had brought the toxic, decaying atmosphere of the Baton Rouge estate directly into the epicenter of my professional triumph. I watched, paralyzed, not by fear but by sheer, morbid fascination, as Valerie spotted a prominent port commissioner she recognized from a country club charity event years ago. She released Charles's arm and practically sprinted across the parquet floor, her heels clicking aggressively. She intercepted the commissioner, seizing his forearm with a terrifying familiarity. "Oh, Richard, it is so wonderful to see you," Valerie gushed, her voice carrying over the ambient noise. "We are just so immensely proud tonight. You know Victoria gets her brilliant logistical mind directly from her father. He always taught her to steer a steady ship." The sheer audacity was breathtaking. The woman who had literally canceled my graduation party, the woman who had demanded I abandon my career to fund my sister's reckless spending, was currently attempting to publicly claim credit for the empire I built entirely without her. She was trying to rebrand my exile as their exceptional parenting. Antoine noticed my rigid posture. He followed my gaze, his dark eyes landing on my family. The easy, relaxed demeanor he had maintained all evening vanished instantly, replaced by the formidable presence of a man who commanded loading docks. His jaw clenched, a muscle feathering near his temple. "Are those the people from the voicemails?" Antoine asked, his voice dropping an octave, sounding like grinding gears. I gave a single imperceptible nod. Elise shifted closer, her expression hardening into a sharp, protective mask. "Do you want me to summon security?" she whispered, reaching into her small clutch for her phone. "I can have them escorted out through the service elevator in 3 minutes. Nobody will even notice." It was a tempting offer, the clean, efficient removal of a biological hazard. But before I could respond, Charles detached himself from Aunt Patty's side. He spotted me standing with the executives. He did not look ashamed. He did not look like a man whose illegal cargo was currently frozen in a customs warehouse, bleeding his final reserves dry. He looked predatory. He looked like a man who believed he held the ultimate trump card. Charles strode toward the center of the ballroom, his heavy footsteps demanding attention. He signaled to a passing waiter, plucking a fresh flute of champagne from the silver tray without breaking stride. He positioned himself perfectly under the largest chandelier, ensuring he captured the attention of the surrounding commissioners and directors. He raised the glass high, the crystal catching the light. "To family," Charles projected his voice, booming with that thick, practiced Baton Rouge drawl. "And to forgiveness, a father's heart is always open. Tonight, I am finally ready to welcome back my prodigal daughter." A ripple of profound, uneasy silence swept outward from his position. The jazz ensemble hesitated for a fraction of a second before continuing their melody. A few polite, deeply confused smiles broke out among the city trade commissioners, unsure if this was a planned speech or an unhinged disruption. They expected me to fold. The entire choreography of their infiltration relied on the assumption that the public pressure of Southern propriety would force my head down. They believed I would accept their toxic grace simply to avoid creating a scene in front of my superiors. They thought the threat of a scandal was a leash they could yank to bring me to heel. Antoine took a deliberate step forward, his large hand reaching toward the lapel of his tuxedo, preparing to signal the venue guards. The protective instinct of my mentor was fierce, a testament to the genuine family I had cultivated in New Orleans. I reached out my fingers, lightly touching Antoine's forearm. The fabric of his suit felt solid, grounding me in the reality I had constructed. "No," I said quietly, my voice steady and resonant. "Let them stay." Elise looked at me, her brow furrowed in genuine concern. "Victoria, they are trying to hijack your moment. They are going to cause a disaster." I turned my gaze away from Charles, looking directly into Elise's eyes. "It is not a disaster if you planned the demolition," I replied. I turned back to face my father. Charles was still holding his glass aloft, a smug, victorious smirk playing on his lips. He firmly believed he had cornered me. He thought the fake disinheritance letter he mailed months ago was a loaded gun pointed directly at my future, and he was currently offering me a humiliating public chance to surrender. He was entirely oblivious to the fact that I held the roots and he merely occupied the shade. I reached my hand deep into the silk lining of my emerald clutch. My fingertips brushed against the cold, crisp edge of a folded document I had carried with me every single day since the parish clerk stamped it with an official binding seal. It was not a defense. It was a weapon of absolute legal devastation. "It is time," I whispered, stepping away from the velvet cocktail table, moving directly into the center of the chandelier's brilliant light, preparing to shatter the patriarch's illusion in front of the entire Gulf Coast. I stepped out from the velvet rope boundary. The parquet floor felt solid beneath the thin soles of my emerald heels. The crowd parted naturally, creating a wide aisle between my position and the center of the chandelier light. Charles stood waiting at the end of that human corridor. He held his champagne flute with a relaxed grip, his posture exuding the lazy confidence of a man who firmly believed he had already won the war. Valerie was beaming beside him, her pastel gown glowing under the crystal bulbs. Savannah had finally stopped flirting with the junior analysts, realizing that the entire ballroom was focusing on our family dynamic. The jazz musicians lowered their instruments. The ambient noise of clinking silverware and murmured trade negotiations faded into a profound, heavy silence. I glided across the polished wood, keeping my spine perfectly straight. I did not look at the ground. I kept my gaze locked directly onto my father. His smirk widened as I approached. He interpreted my calm demeanor as surrender. He genuinely expected me to lower my head and accept his public toast and beg for the financial grace he pretended to still possess. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from him. This was the optimal distance for a negotiation. Close enough to command the space, but far enough to establish an impenetrable boundary. Charles opened his mouth, likely preparing to deliver another condescending platitude about the virtues of a forgiving patriarch. I did not give him the opportunity to speak. "You sent a certified letter to my apartment yesterday morning," I said. I did not raise my voice. I projected my words from the diaphragm, ensuring the acoustics of the historic ballroom carried my statement to the port commissioners standing in the back rows. Charles blinked, momentarily thrown off balance by my directness. He recovered quickly, adjusting his lapel. "Yes, I did," he replied, puffing his chest out. "And considering the severity of that document, I thought it was highly appropriate for you to publicly acknowledge your mistakes tonight. We are willing to halt the legal proceedings if you show proper remorse, Victoria." I tilted my head slightly, observing the sheer magnitude of his delusion. "You threatened to completely disinherit me from the family trust," I continued, my voice ringing clear and resonant. "You explicitly stated that my grandfather and his historic waterfront estate would be transferred entirely to Savannah. You tried to weaponize generational wealth to force my submission." Valerie stepped forward, her smile dropping into a harsh, warning scowl. "Victoria, keep your voice down," she hissed through clenched teeth. "Do not embarrass us in front of these important people." I ignored my mother entirely. My focus remained anchored on the man who had tried to destroy my career over an auto insurance premium. "Your attorney drafted a very intimidating threat, Charles," I said, "but you made a catastrophic miscalculation. You forgot that the state of Louisiana operates strictly on civil law." The smirk on his face faltered, cracking just a fraction of an inch. A flicker of genuine confusion passed behind his eyes. He had spent his entire life bullying contractors and intimidating country club waitstaff, but he had never bothered to actually read the legal statutes governing his own inherited wealth. "Let me explain the mechanics of the trap you just stepped into," I announced. I wanted the shipping magnates and corporate directors surrounding us to hear every single word. I wanted them to witness exactly how I handled hostile negotiations. When my grandfather passed away, he did not transfer the deed of the Baton Rouge estate to you. He knew exactly what kind of man you were. He knew you would eventually leverage the property, squander its value, or use it to manipulate your children. A low murmur rippled through the crowd of executives. Antoine crossed his arms, a proud, stoic guardian, watching his protege dismantle an adversary. "Grandfather utilized a specific estate mechanism," I explained, pacing slowly in a tight semicircle around my parents. "He granted you and Valerie the usufruct of the property. That gave you the legal right to occupy the house, to live within its walls, and to enjoy the shade of its trees. But he never gave you ownership. He bypassed you completely. He transferred the naked ownership directly to me." Charles lowered his champagne glass. The liquid inside sloshed dangerously close to the rim. His face, previously flushed with arrogant triumph, began to drain of color. A pale, sickly gray washed over his complexion. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny the claim, but his vocal cords refused to produce a sound. "I have legally owned that estate since the day I turned 18 years old," I stated, delivering the killing blow. You cannot disinherit a landlord from a property they already own. You cannot transfer a deed that does not possess your name. The letter you sent yesterday was nothing more than expensive fictional intimidation. Savannah dropped her smartphone. The expensive device hit the parquet floor with a sharp cracking sound, the glass screen shattering upon impact. For the first time in her pampered existence, the gravity of a situation pierced through her narcissistic bubble. She looked back and forth between her frozen father and her horrified mother, finally realizing that the infinite fountain of wealth had just run completely dry. But the lesson in civil law is not over. I continued, reaching my hand back into my emerald clutch. Usufruct is not an unconditional gift. It comes with strict, legally binding obligations. The occupant is required by law to maintain the asset and pay all associated property taxes. If the occupant fails to do so, they commit waste against the estate, and when waste occurs, the naked owner holds the absolute right to terminate the usufruct agreement immediately. I pulled the crisp, folded document from my purse. The thick parchment paper rustled in the quiet room. Because you spent the last year financing Savannah and her reckless lifestyle, you drained your liquid assets, I said, holding the document up for him to see. You ignored the final notice envelope sitting on your kitchen counter. You failed to pay the parish property taxes. You abused the estate. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. I extended my arm and pressed the legal summons directly against his chest. Charles instinctively brought his free hand up, his trembling fingers gripping the paper. I filed a formal petition for the termination of your usufruct yesterday afternoon, I declared. A civil judge signed the order this morning. You are officially evicted. The Baton Rouge estate is mine. You have exactly 30 days to vacate my property. The ballroom fell into a stunned, glorious silence. The patriarchal illusion that Charles had maintained for decades shattered completely, the pieces falling onto the polished floor like broken glass. He looked down at the court summons in his hand, staring at the official red seal stamped at the bottom of the page. He was a king who had just discovered his crown was made of paper. Valerie covered her mouth with both hands, stifling a jagged, humiliating sob. Her entire social standing, her country club memberships, and her carefully curated facade evaporated in an instant. She was no longer the wealthy matriarch. She was a tenant facing imminent removal. I did not gloat. I did not raise my voice or hurl insults. I simply turned my back on them. I walked away from the shattered remnants of my biological family and returned to the velvet cocktail table where Antoine and Elise were waiting. The crowd of port executives parted from me once again, but this time their eyes were filled with profound, unshakable respect. The conflict was over. The swamp had been drained, and the roots were finally secure. The 30-day eviction window dictated by the civil court passed with a swift, merciless precision. I did not return to Baton Rouge to supervise their departure. I hired a specialized property management firm to oversee the transition, ensuring every legal parameter was followed to the exact letter of the law. I received daily reports detailing the steady, undeniable collapse of the Jackson family facade. Stripped of their leverage, Charles and Valerie faced a reality they had spent decades avoiding. When the banks realized the historic waterfront estate was no longer a valid collateral asset, the remaining credit lines vanished overnight. The failing maritime firm Charles had secretly invested in filed for bankruptcy restructuring, taking his last liquid dollars down with the sinking ship. The country club suspended their membership for delinquent dues. The sycophantic friends who used to attend their lavish garden parties suddenly stopped returning phone calls. High society operates on a brutal transactional ledger, and my parents were officially bankrupt in every conceivable currency. They were forced to downsize into a cramped two-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the parish. It was a bleak, generic complex situated directly beneath an interstate overpass. The constant rumble of commercial freight trucks rattled their thin windows day and night. There were no sweeping verandas or imported marble countertops. They were left to navigate a small, suffocating space, forced to look at each other and the ruins of the empire they had squandered. The most profound transformation, however, belonged to my older sister. For 25 years, Savannah existed in a pristine, insulated bubble, shielded from the friction of the real world. Her tears had always functioned as a reliable currency, purchasing endless leniency and luxury. But a landlord collecting rent on a mediocre apartment does not accept tears as payment. With Charles and Valerie barely scraping together enough funds to cover their own basic utilities, the endless fountain of retail therapy dried up instantly. Savannah was cut off. She was faced with an ultimatum she had never before encountered: earn a paycheck or face the streets. Lacking any viable college degree devoid of practical skills and possessing a resume that consisted entirely of fabricated lifestyle blogging experience, her employment options were severely limited. She registered with a local temporary staffing agency, desperate for an indoor position that did not require heavy lifting or a uniform. The agency placed her in the only entry-level administrative role available that week. The universe possesses a flawless cinematic sense of irony. Infinity. The job was located in New Orleans. Savannah was assigned to the ground floor reception desk of the Central Port Authority headquarters. The poetry of the situation is something I witness every single weekday morning at 7:30 sharp. I step through the revolving glass doors of the towering glass and steel building, holding a cup of dark chicory coffee. The lobby echoes with the hurried footsteps of regional directors, customs agents, and shipping magnates. At the epicenter of this chaotic commerce, seated behind a curved granite counter, sits Savannah. She wears a standard-issue corporate lanyard around her neck. The designer sunglasses and silk blouses are gone, replaced by sensible, affordable office attire. Her primary responsibility consists of answering a multi-line phone system, sorting incoming federal mail, and managing the security access for the executive elevators. I walk across the polished terrazzo floor, my heels clicking a steady, authoritative rhythm. Savannah looks up from her computer monitor. There is no trace of the entitled, mocking smirk she used to wear while lounging in the bed of my grandfather's vintage truck. Her eyes are tired, reflecting the stark exhaustion of a woman who finally understands the crushing weight of a 40-hour workweek. She does not speak. We do not exchange familial pleasantries. The silence between us is a vast, unbridgeable canyon. Savannah reaches out with a manicured finger and presses a small silver button on her control console. A sharp electronic chime rings out, signaling the release of the magnetic lock on the executive turnstile. She lowers her gaze back to her keyboard. Every single morning, the golden child must swallow her pride and physically grant me access to the empire I command. I pass through the gate, stepping into the private elevator that carries me up to the suite overlooking the muddy, churning waters of the Mississippi River. I do not feel pity. I do not feel guilt. I feel the quiet, grounding satisfaction of a universe correcting its own balance. On the first Saturday of the new month, after the property managers confirmed the Baton Rouge estate was entirely vacant, I drove up Interstate 10 to reclaim my inheritance. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless azure, the Louisiana humidity hanging low and thick over the bayous. I turned the rental car onto the familiar crushed gravel driveway. The tires crunched a familiar rhythm as I rolled past the wrought iron gates. The historic house stood in the distance, a sprawling two-story structure framed by wide, welcoming porches and tall white columns. For years, this property represented a suffocating prison, a place where my achievements were erased and my worth was constantly diminished. I parked near the carriage house and stepped out into the quiet afternoon air. The silence was profound. There were no theatrical sobs echoing from the second-floor windows. There was no booming, arrogant voice demanding compliance from the study. The toxic atmosphere had been scrubbed clean, leaving behind only the timeless, enduring architecture my grandfather had loved. I walked across the front lawn, the grass soft and green beneath my boots. I headed directly toward the giant, ancient magnolia tree anchoring the center of the yard. I stood beneath its sprawling canopy, surrounded by the deep green leaves and the intoxicating citrus-sweet scent of its white blossoms. I reached out and pressed my palm against the rough, grooved bark. The trunk was wide and immovable, a testament to decades of silent growth and quiet endurance. Charles had wanted to bring a chainsaw to this monument, eager to tear it down and pour a shallow concrete pool over the earth just to appease a fleeting tantrum. He viewed the tree as an obstacle. He never understood the value of what lay beneath the surface. I looked down at the dark, rich soil wrapping around the thick, gnarled roots protruding from the ground. The leaves belong to whoever lives here, little bird, but the roots belong to the one holding the deed. My grandfather's voice echoed in my memory, clear and resonant. I had finally fulfilled the unspoken promise I made to him on those docks so many years ago. I did not just protect his legacy, I secured my own. Later that evening, the gravel driveway crunched again. Antoine and Elise arrived carrying bags of fresh Gulf shrimp lemons and seasoned crab boil. We gathered on the wide wraparound porch, the string lights casting a warm, golden glow over the wooden floorboards. The air filled with the scent of cayenne pepper and rich spices, the exact aroma my graduation day was supposed to carry. Parked carefully by the carriage house, gleaming under the twilight sky, was the vintage navy blue pickup truck. I had dispatched a recovery team to Savannah's former apartment complex the morning the eviction was finalized, legally repossessing the vehicle, utilizing the original title documents I secured from the parish records. The chrome bumpers reflected the porch lights, waiting for my commute on Monday morning. I leaned against the wooden railing, holding a glass of iced tea, listening to Elise laugh at one of Antoine's gruff maritime stories. This was my chosen family. These were the people who recognized my grit, valued my precision, and stood beside me when the siege engines arrived at my door. My biological family had tried to push me out. They attempted to erase my milestones, siphon my resources, and sabotage the very career that gave me purpose. They expected me to shrink into the shadows of their manufactured drama. But in the silence of my exile, I did not wither. I analyzed the terrain. I learned the precise mechanics of the world they ignored. I built an undeniable, self-sustaining empire on the riverfront, constructed brick by brick with my own hands. I allowed them to rely on their fragile illusions, while I quietly secured the heavy, unshakable truth. I took a slow sip of my tea, feeling the cool evening breeze drift across the lawn, rustling the thick leaves of the magnolia tree. The storm had passed, the swamp was drained, and the horizon stretched out clear and infinite. The surface had been reclaimed, but more importantly, the roots, finally, were mine. The American dream of the traditional family often paints a picture of unwavering loyalty, Sunday dinners, and a safety net woven from unconditional love. We are taught from a very young age that blood is a permanent bond, an unbreakable contract that guarantees a sanctuary against the harshness of the outside world. But as we see in the harrowing and triumphant story of Victoria, Charles, Valerie, and Savannah, the reality behind closed mahogany doors can be vastly different. When the appearance of a perfect family becomes more important than the emotional reality of the people living within it, the home ceases to be a sanctuary, it becomes a theater. And in this theater, the roles assigned to children can dictate the course of their entire lives, often with devastating consequences. Reflecting on Victoria's journey from a dismissed, exploited daughter to a formidable, independent architect of her own empire, the most profound lessons do not simply revolve around revenge or legal technicalities. The core of this narrative is a stark, unflinching examination of parenting values, family responsibility, and the long-term guidance we owe the next generation. It forces us to ask what it truly means to raise a child, and how a lack of honesty, fairness, and emotional awareness can rot a family tree from the inside out. In traditional family structures, there is frequently an overwhelming pressure to maintain a seamless public facade. For Charles and Valerie, their standing in Baton Rouge high society was their most prized currency. To protect this illusion, they committed one of the most insidious sins of modern parenting. They chose to manage their children's symptoms rather than address the root causes. Savannah was the golden child, but her pedestal was built on quicksand. By constantly coddling her, wiping away every consequence of her actions, and funding her reckless lifestyle, her parents were not demonstrating love. They were performing a slow, quiet act of emotional abandonment. We often view overindulgence as a form of excessive care, but it is deeply counterconventional to realize that giving a child everything is a catastrophic failure of long-term guidance. By shielding Savannah from the friction of reality, Charles and Valerie robbed her of the opportunity to develop resilience, accountability, and a genuine sense of self-worth. They created a fragile adult, incapable of surviving outside a fabricated bubble. True family responsibility requires the courage to let our children fail, to let them feel the discomfort of their poor choices, and to guide them through the consequences rather than writing a check to make the problem disappear. Conversely, Victoria's experience highlights the immense psychological toll placed on the strong child. How often do parents lean on their most capable children, transforming their resilience into a utility? When a parent says, "You're stronger, you don't need us," they are not offering a compliment. They are offering an excuse for their own emotional neglect. Fairness in parenting does not necessarily mean identical financial distribution, but it absolutely demands equal emotional awareness. It requires parents to recognize that the quiet, independent child who asks for nothing still needs to be seen, celebrated, and valued for their intrinsic worth, not just for what they can provide or endure. Victoria's milestones were erased because her parents lacked the emotional honesty to balance the scales of their attention. This dynamic illustrates a critical flaw in how we often approach the concept of family loyalty in American culture. We are culturally conditioned to believe that children owe their parents perpetual grace simply by virtue of biology. We expect the younger generation to absorb the toxicity that favoritism and the financial exploitation under the guise of respecting your elders. But the most profound lesson, hidden within the Louisiana bayous and the grand waterfront estate, is a philosophical shift in how we view the relationship between parent and child. Consider the legal concept of usufruct that saved Victoria the right to use and enjoy the shade of an estate without holding the deed to the roots. Parenting in its purest, most ethical form is a psychological usufruct. Parents do not own their children. We are not given the deed to their futures, their identities, or their success. We are simply granted the temporary privilege to nurture them, to stand in their shade, and to guide their growth. If we abuse that privilege, if we commit emotional waste, if we try to manipulate their branches to serve our own selfish needs, we forfeit our right to remain in their lives. Victoria's parents believed they owned the estate of their daughter's life, entirely oblivious to the fact that she had always held the deed to her own soul. As we navigate our own relationships, whether as parents trying to guide the next generation or as adult children attempting to heal from the ghosts of our past, we must embrace a radical, uncompromising emotional honesty. We must build family structures rooted in accountability rather than obligation. We must teach our children that their worth is not determined by how useful they are to us, nor by how loudly they demand our attention, but by the integrity with which they build their own lives. If you found a piece of your own history hidden within these reflections, if you have ever had to quietly pack your bags in the middle of the night to save your own future, you are not alone. There is a whole community of us learning how to plant new gardens in foreign soil. Subscribe and follow Amanda Told Stories for more narratives that explore the messy, beautiful, and sometimes painful truths of human relationships. We share these journeys because sometimes hearing another person's survival is the exact blueprint we need for our own. Ultimately, we are told that a parent's greatest duty is to protect their children from the harshness of the world. But perhaps that is a fundamental misunderstanding of love. Perhaps a parent's truest duty is to raise a child so capable, so deeply rooted in their own self-worth that the world must learn to respect them. Victoria's parents tried to break her to keep their illusion intact, and in doing so, they accidentally forged a titan they could no longer control. Blood does not automatically demand loyalty. It merely offers an introduction. The family we are born into gives us our initial shape, but it is the boundaries we choose to enforce that ultimately define our silhouette. As the lights go down on the gala and the dust settles on the empty Baton Rouge estate, we are left with a quiet, lingering question. If the people who gave you your roots demand that you never grow, is the true tragedy leaving the garden? Or is the true tragedy staying until you wither? Closure is rarely an apology received. More often than not, it is simply a door you finally decide to lock from the inside.